Okay, so welcome everybody to this practice run of my talk on the combinatorics of cell closures and regular Hessenberg varieties. And so this is joint work with Martha Prekup and Alexander Wu. And I want to start off this talk by just playing a little combinatorial game with a permutation and a set. So we'll start with the permutation 1, 5, 4, 2, 6, 3. And the set J will be a set of just ordered pairs of adjacent integers, in this case, 1, 2, 4, 5. And we're going to ignore J for just a second and just look at W. And the first step in this game is that we're going to highlight all of the places where W has a descent. And so I've highlighted the first descent block in red and the second descent block in blue. And this is like if you were to plot W on a graph, it says you start at height 1, go up to 5, then descend down to 4 and descend down to 2. Climb back up to 6 and then drop back down to 3. So the descent blocks are these 3 numbers and those 2 numbers. And then once we've highlighted those, we're going to take all permutations of the numbers in each descent block, but keeping those numbers in the same spots, just permuting 5, 4, and 2 and permuting 3 and 6. And so we get 12 permutations within those descent blocks. Of course, we have the permutation W, and then you can see that you get this one just by permuting 3 and 6. Here we're permuting 5, 2, and 4. Okay, so once you have those 12 permutations, now we're going to focus on J. And so we're going to highlight the elements of J in our permutations. So I've dropped the color coding for just 1 second, but now I'm going to highlight 1, 2, and 4, 5. And so I've highlighted 1, 2 in red and 5 and 4 in blue. And so now the last thing we're going to do is we're going to cross out any permutations where the distance between 1 and 2 is more than 1 if there's a descent. So if 1 is to the left of 2, you're fine. But if 2 is to the left of 1, then you need to be adjacent to 1. And actually that doesn't show up in these examples at all. But we do see that 5 appears to the left of 4 and is more than 1 spot to the left of 4 in this column right here. So we're going to cross out those 2 permutations and then keep all the rest. Okay, so this property, if you can pass this combinatorial rule that just says you can't have what you would call a long descent, maybe a descent over another number. That rule is what we're going to say is J admissible in this case. So these 2 are not J admissible. The rest of the permutations are J admissible. Okay, so hopefully that game is clear, and that's going to be the answer. The secret to our main theorem is the description of the closure of a Hessenberg-Schubert cell is going to be this collection of J admissible permutations that are less than W in Bruhat order, where we restrict to only inverting numbers within the descent blocks. Okay, so before I go into any defining any definitions or going into notation, I just want to give you an example or a flavor of the game we're going to play geometrically. So we're going to start with a cellular decomposition of our ambient space, which is called the flag variety. And I'll define that in a second, but you can think of it as it looks something like this. And the way to think of this is like we have a 3-dimensional space, and on its boundary, we have 2 2-dimensional spaces. And on their boundaries, we have 1-dimensional spaces. And on those boundaries, we have a point. And you can kind of think of this as like a room where you have, if you have a 2-dimensional space meeting another 2-dimensional space, they would meet in a line. And 2 1-dimensional spaces would be in a point. So we're just kind of cutting up this ambient space into linear subspaces in some way. And we're going to take that Schubert cell decomposition, and we're going to restrict it to a subvariety of the flag variety. This one is called the Springer fiber. It's a set of all flags that are fixed by a nilpotent linear operator. And in this case, when you restrict, a lot of things disappear. So 3 cells just disappear altogether. This one, and this one just don't intersect that subvariety at all. And even within a cell, we might lose some of the variables. So we started with a 2-dimensional cell, and when we restrict to the Springer fiber, we get a 1-dimensional cell. In fact, this entry here is forced to be 0. And topologically, what this looks like then is what's kind of a string of pearls. So we have 2 1-dimensional cells, and of course, this free variable here corresponds to a copy of C. And as B goes to infinity, you tend towards a point over here on the other cell, and that point is the one where A is equal to 0. So if you take the limit of this cell, you get that 1 point. Or if you take the closure of the cell, you get that whole cell in a point. If you take the closure of a green cell, you get the whole you get the whole cell plus this 1 point, which is the, the 1 point compactification of C, I guess. So this is the game we're going to play. And what I wanted to point out is that while the Schubert cell decomposition is a CW complex, which means that if you take the closure of a cell, you get a union of smaller dimensional cells. These cellular closures that we're looking at don't have that property. In fact, the closure of one cell might contain a point of another cell, and that cell might be the same dimension as in this case. Okay. So this is a slide that seems to appear on every talk about flag varieties, and it's almost too information to understand, but it at least sets the convention so that if you've seen these talks before, you know what our notation is. And in this case, we're going to let G be the general linear group of invertible n-by-n matrices, and B minus are the Borel subgroups of upper triangular and lower triangular invertible matrices, respectively. If you take the intersection of those two groups, you get the diagonal matrices, which is the maximal torus in GLNC. So this is just some notation that we're going to use later. And then we say that a full flag in Cn is a nested sequence of vector subspaces where the dimension of the ith piece is I. And so what you should think of here is like, I've been showing you pictures of matrices. The idea is that you have an invertible matrix and you're defining the subspace V sub I to be the span of the first I columns of that invertible matrix. And so the set of flags are not in bijection with the set of invertible matrices. They're in bijection with cosets of invertible matrices where you're taking the action of the Borel subgroup on the right. So the set of all flags is a homogeneous topological space, and it's known as the flag variety for GLNC. Okay. So there's an action of G on the set of all flags. There's an action of the subtorus T on the set of all flags. And if we want to know which flags are fixed by that action of T, it ends up being the Weil group, which in type A is isomorphic to the symmetric group. So just think of permutation matrices or permutation cosets when we're talking about T fixed points. And the varieties that I'm going to be studying today do not always have a full torus action, but they do have a one-dimensional torus action that has the same fixed point set. So when I say a fixed point, you should just be thinking of a permutation flag. So finally, the Bruhat decomposition of GLNC restricts to what's called the Schubert cell decomposition of the flag variety. And so the Bruhat decomposition just says that every invertible matrix can be written as a product of of an upper triangular matrix times a permutation matrix times another upper triangular matrix. And if we restrict to the flag variety or mod out by the action of B on the right, then we end up getting these affine cells that are basically just B orbits of a permutation. So we're going to let C sub W denote the Schubert cell corresponding to W, and then the Schubert cell decomposition just says that the flag variety is the disjoint union of these Schubert cells. And I guess one other neat fact is that the dimension of the Schubert cell is the length of the permutation when we write it as a product of simple transpositions. And then finally, C sub W is a Schubert cell. We're going to let X sub W denote the closure of a Schubert cell, and that will be the union of over all V that's less than or equal to W in Bruhat order of the Schubert cells corresponding to V. So here's the picture. And so what I mean by the closure of a cell is you're saying this is the permutation 2, 3, 1, and we're taking the union of all the Schubert cells where V is less than or equal to 2, 3, 1 in Bruhat order. So we end up getting that the closure of this cell contains this cell, and that cell, which is just a point. Okay, so this is the last time I'm actually going to show you the cells. From now on, I'll just write the permutations, but know that those permutations are indexing some cell in our Bruhat decomposition. Okay, so now we're ready to define the main characters in this paper, and that is Hessenberg varieties. And to define a Hessenberg variety, we need two pieces of data. The first is the Hessenberg function, which is just kind of a combinatorial object. It's a map from a set of integers from 1 to n into itself, such that it's weakly increasing, meaning that h of I plus 1 is greater than or equal to h of I, and also h of I is always greater than I. So it's kind of restricting to I guess, depending on how you set things up, it's restricting to lower triangular matrices or something. Okay, so we're going to typically denote a Hessenberg function by a tuple h1, h2 up to hn. And here are just some examples for n equals 3. you can see that if H of 1 is 1, H of 2 is 2, and H of 3 is 3, then we're just getting the upper triangular matrices. And then as H of i's increase, we just kind of restrict down so we have more things below the upper triangular matrices. So this is just saying that we should be 0 below this red line. Of course, these red lines are Dick paths. So it's kind of a fun fact that Hessenberg functions are in correspondence with Dick paths, and so they're counted by the Catalan numbers. But just keep this picture in mind. H of I will be a tuple of integers. And if I ever write down capital H, that just means the set of matrices that are non-zero up here and 0 below the red path. And I've also shown you the Dick paths or the Hessenberg functions for n equals 4. So for the purposes of today's talk, we're going to focus on this one primarily, which is the one where H of I is equal to I plus 1. So H of 1 is 2, H of 2 is 3, and then H of 4 is 4. H of 3 is 4, and H of 4 is 4. Okay, so I said we needed 2 pieces of information. The second piece of information is a linear transformation X. Okay, so given a Hessenberg function and any linear transformation from Cn to Cn, then we can define the associated Hessenberg variety, and that will be the set of all flags, which we denote by V sub bullet, such that X maps the ith subspace of V into the H of I subspace of V. And in terms of matrices, this just says that we're taking this matrix, so this linear transformation X, and requiring that it maps the ith column into the span of the first H of I columns. And this is equivalent to the following definition, which this definition holds an arbitrary Lie type. And it says that it's to take all the cosets G mod B, and we require that G inverse X G ends up into the subspace H, where H, capital H, is a subspace of matrices that are non-zero above the red paths that I've shown you before, and 0 below and to the left of those red paths. Okay, and just a little bit of notation. We say that if X is regular, semi-simple, or nilpotent, then the associated Hessenberg variety is said to be regular, semi-simple, or nilpotent. And remember, regular just means that, at least in type A, regular means that the eigenvalues for each Jordan block are distinct. Semi-simple means the matrix X is diagonalizable, and nilpotent would mean that if you take X and raise it to a high enough power, you would eventually get the 0 matrix. Okay, so the landscape of Hessenberg varieties looks something like this. So there's kind of 3 main families that get studied quite prolifically. We have regular semi-simple, well, we have semi-simple Hessenberg varieties, nilpotent Hessenberg varieties, and then within that, we also have a set of regular nilpotent, regular semi-simple, and those fall into what are known as regular Hessenberg varieties. And today, we're going to focus pretty much exclusively on the regular Hessenberg varieties, where H of I is equal to I plus 1. We call this the standard Hessenberg function, or the standard Hessenberg space. And within that family, we have what's known as the Peterson variety, which has connections to quantum cohomology. And it's just kind of an interesting variety because it has lots of symmetry and interesting combinatorics associated with it. And if you take the same Hessenberg function, but look at this regular semi-simple matrix, then you get the permutahedral variety, or the toric variety of the Weil chamber, which was originally studied by Stembridge, I think, in '92. Okay, so remember, regular nilpotent means that you're going to have 1 Jordan block, and you're going to be nilpotent, meaning that if you take n to the high enough power, you're going to get 0. Semi-simple means you're going to be diagonalizable, and regular semi-simple means that you're diagonalizable and you have distinct eigenvalues. And then we've already seen one example of a non-regular nilpotent Hessenberg variety, and that was the Springer fibers. Those were the sets of flags that were fixed by a nilpotent operator. And fixed means that X times or N times V sub I is contained in V sub I. Okay, so we've seen this example, and now we're going to study these examples. Okay, and so since we're looking at regular Hessenberg varieties, I wanted to show you just what a regular linear transformation would look like. You might have a nilpotent part, you'd have a Jordan block, in this case, a Jordan block of size 2, and then of course those 2 diagonal entries have to be the same because we're supposed to have the same eigenvalue for that Jordan block. And then you might have another block that's semi-simple, but it has a different eigenvalue. So if you take this semi-simple matrix plus this nilpotent matrix, you get a regular element in your in your Lie algebra for GLN. Okay, so if you remember the game, we had one other piece of information, and that was a set of tuples, ordered pairs of adjacent integers that we call J. And what J is doing is just combinatorially encoding the sizes and the placements of the Jordan blocks. So in the case where J was 1, 2, 3, 4, that meant that the nilpotent part of our matrix looked like this. It had a non-zero entry in position 1, 2, and a non-zero entry in position 3, 4. And then, of course, because we're working with a regular element, we must have Jordan blocks that look like this. And we could have any, these numbers don't matter at all. This could have been 0, 0, and 1, 1, or -2, -2, -3, -3. So the actual eigenvalues don't matter. It's just really the Jordan type or the Jordan decomposition of your matrix. Okay, so the preliminary result, or the main result that we're going to use, was due in type A to Tomashko, and in 2013 pre-cup proved this in all Lie types. The Hessenberg varieties are paved by affine cells, and if you play the game correctly, you can think of those cells as just being Schubert cells intersected with your Hessenberg variety. And so by play the game correctly, I just mean you have to pick the right Schubert cell decomposition in relation to your operator X, or what we're calling X of J here. And so the two questions that arise when we restrict that Schubert cell decomposition to the Hessenberg variety is exactly when are the cells non-empty? When do they not disappear? And then what is the closure of a Hessenberg-Schubert cell? Can we say what that looks like? And that's the goal of today's talk, is just to say exactly what these cell closures look like in the case where we're studying the standard Hessenberg function. So this is the one that corresponds to the permutahedral variety, or the Peterson variety. We want to have the upper triangular matrices plus one more diagonal. Okay, and so let's see here. It says that the Hessenberg-Schubert cell is going to be non-empty. So this is asking, when is the cell non-empty? It's non-empty exactly when W has no long descents coming from our set J. Okay, in that case, we call it a J admissible. So remember that we looked at the permutation, and we looked at our set J, and we asked if 2 is to the left of 1, is it adjacent to 1? And if not, then it's not admissible. So this permutation W, 2, 3, 4, 1, is not J admissible, but it is K admissible. The reason it's K admissible is because K is 2, 3, 3, 4, and 2 appears to the left of 3, and 3 appears to the left of 4, so that's fine. And I should say that this J admissibility condition is restricted just to the standard Hessenberg space. So we can generalize it, but for today's talk, this is just what we're looking at. So we're focusing on permutations where if there's a descent coming from J, that it has to be an adjacent descent. Okay, so V now, 4213 is an example of a J admissible permutation, but not a K admissible one. So it's J admissible because though 2 appears to the left of 1, they're next to each other. However, it's not K admissible because, well, 2 is to the left of 3, which is fine. 4 is to the left of 3, and it's too far to the left. Hopefully that's clear with those two examples, kind of showing what K admissibility and J admissibility are telling us. Okay, and so our first theorem then says that if you start with 2 J admissible permutations in S of n, then the intersection of the Hessenberg-Schubert cell for V, when you intersect it with the closure of the Hessenberg-Schubert cell for W, that will be non-empty if and only if V can be obtained from W by permuting the numbers in the descent blocks of W. So again, this is the game that we played earlier. If you can get from W down to V by just permuting things inside of the descent blocks of W, and V is J admissible, then that's going to be in the closure of that cell. So here's an example to illustrate that theorem. J is 1, 2. Just means that our operator looks something like this. Then when we take the Schubert cell decomposition for the full flag variety and restrict it to the Hessenberg variety, you can see that 2, 3, 1 is ghosted because it's not J admissible. But then the closure of this cell will be everything below it that is J admissible. And of course here we have the descent block is all 3, 2, 1. So it's everything below it in Brouillard order that is J admissible. So this is a 2-dimensional cell. I should say that all the varieties we're studying today are irreducible. So when we see a top dimensional cell, if I look at the closure, it's going to be everything below it in the diagram. Now, if we wanted to look at what is the closure of 3, 1, 2, then we only have a descent block of 3, 1. And so we permute 3 and 1, we get 1, 3, 2. And so the closure of this cell, which was a 2-dimensional cell in the Schubert cell decomposition of the full flag variety, is actually just a 1-dimensional cell in the Hessenberg-Schubert cell decomposition. And the closure is just, if you're still looking at these diagrams, this is just another CP1 or another sphere. And then the closure of 1, 3, 2 is, of course, just this one-dimensional sphere here. Okay, so that was our first theorem, and our second theorem says that the closure of a Hessenberg-Schubert cell is actually isomorphic to a smaller standard regular Hessenberg variety. So what we mean by that is it's a Hessenberg variety corresponding to the standard shape, but in a smaller dimensional flag variety. So an example here to illustrate that is if we take J to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and we look at the closure of the cell 3, 4, 2, 1. Well, here again, the descent block is 4, 2, 1. So we take all permutations of 4, 2, and 1, and exactly one of those is not admissible. And we get something that has the closure that intersects 5 cells below it. And the point here is to that theorem is just saying that the closure of this cell is actually isomorphic to that smaller standard Hessenberg variety that we saw before. So hopefully that kind of illustrates what that isomorphism theorem is saying. And this is the one thing that we don't think will generalize to non-standard Hessenberg shapes, is that the closure of a cell will not be as easy to describe because it won't be isomorphic to just some smaller standard Hessenberg variety that we know what that looks like. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a few last highlights in the paper as a sales pitch to get you to read it when it comes out in December or January this year. These results are stated in general Lie type, and so I've tried to give you the type A version of that. But we do all these results hold in general Lie type, and the extensions, they extend in the way that you think they would, right? If you were looking at this talk and saying, well, he's just looking at positive roots and we're looking at actions of vowel groups on positive roots, you're right. There is whatever you think would hold does hold. We also give a classification of the singular torus fixed points in these regular Hessenberg varieties. And we describe the K-theory and cohomology classes of Hessenberg-Schubert cell closures in the cohomology of the flag variety, the K-flared of the flag variety. So that's pretty much all I had planned for today. Thank you very much for your time. I do have just 2 extra slides in case I have questions and I wanted to talk about some of those things. But thanks for your time. Have a great day.